Hello, I'm Liesel Vordren. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, and I'm going to be talking about the last African Union summit in Niamey in Niger. It was an extraordinary summit dedicated to the African Continental Free Trade Area, and then a coordination meeting about the relationship between the African Union and the regional economic communities. Now, to a large extent, this summit was a test for the AU reforms that were launched 3 years ago, actually in July 2016. The plan for the reforms were made and led by the former chairperson and president of Rwanda, President Paul Kagame, and his implementation unit at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa. So it was a test case because the aim was to reduce the number of summits of the African Union to only one per year. The reason being that it was felt by some, these big African Union summits with huge delegations really was an occasion to make speeches and to make decisions that were not implemented very often, and that the gatherings of the African Union should be more focused, streamlined, in order to make the organization much more robust and to make sure that if decisions are taken, that they are implemented. This is, of course, is a debatable notion whether the work of the summit should be reduced to only one a year of heads of state, because some people feel the African Union heads of state don't know one another. They need even more interaction in actual fact. Some also say that the issue of the cost of hosting a second summit should not be on the table, because as was the case in Niamey, some foreign governments, India, others, for example, gave funding for that summit. But it was felt, for example, by civil society in Niamey that hosting such a big summit in a country that is really at the bottom of the UNDP list for human development, that is cash-strapped, even if it is foreign funding, there was that sense, why is this not maybe being held in Addis Ababa, where all the infrastructure is? So there is quite a bit of debate. And at the end of the day, the summit in Niamey wasn't very different to other summits, because we had over 30 heads of state coming together, launching the Continental Free Trade Area, and in the end, the coordination meeting between the African Union and the RECs, which was the main purpose of this summit and of the reforms, was almost a sideshow and lasted a few hours, and really all the focus was on the Continental Free Trade Area, which of course is an important milestone for the continent. So first of all, on the Niamey summit, as I said, the aims of having only one full summit of heads of state of the continent in a year was partially undermined by this big extraordinary summit on the Continental Free Trade Area. So the reform aims were not attained. Secondly, the AU RECs meeting, which was really what was new of the Niamey summit, was disappointing to many. This relationship between the AU and RECs is crucial for the African Union and for the continent, because the RECs, the 8 regional economic communities recognized by the African Union, are considered the building blocks of the African Union. The relationship between the AU and the RECs are often very problematic and complex, because many of the RECs started very differently, organically, not in relation to being building blocks of the African Union. Organizations like SADC, for example, started out as the frontline states fighting apartheid in South Africa, and in 1992 it evolved into SADC. So the relations between, for example, SADC and the AU, or ECOWAS and the AU, it's not They're not all the same, and it's not always clear, but it's crucial. Why? Because when it comes to one of the core aims of the AU, to ensure peace and security on the continent, the question is always asked in terms of subsidiarity. So the regional economic community should take charge of any conflicts before the AU steps in. But under what circumstances can the AU step in? When Burundi, for example, there's a crisis, the EAC doesn't seem to be active enough. We've seen that in many issues, the Central African Republic, Sudan, others on the continent. So going forward, following the Niamey summit, there will be another one then mid-year, a coordination meeting. We're not sure where it will be then next year. It will be a challenge for the AU to see how it can clearly define this relationship between the AU and the RECs. So that's the second point. Then, of course, as I mentioned, the Continental Free Trade Area was an important feature of the Niamey summit. It was decided that Ghana would host the secretariat of the CFTA. There were a couple of other countries that also bid for it. It was announced that on the 1st of July 2020, the Continental Free Trade Area, with its 26 ratifications now, will enter into force. The big highlight was that Nigeria, of course, signed up, ratified, and joined the Continental Free Trade Area, which it seemed logical despite many of the disagreements or dialogue within Nigeria, because clearly the big countries, industrialized countries with sophisticated economies that do export, are the ones that will benefit the most from the Continental Free Trade Area. And talking to people in Niamey and the sentiments around this Continental Free Trade Area, I think my sense is that civil society and organizations like ourselves and others need to track the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area, even beyond just the trade issue, but also that it's not just the big, strong economies that will dominate. Because there was that fear, especially, as I said, in Niamey, a small economy, and that in actual fact the Continental Free Trade Area will benefit big companies from countries like South Africa or Nigeria or Egypt or Morocco. And the idea is to also strengthen the Continental Free Trade Area and its benefits for smaller countries like Niger. But it was an important symbolic launch of the Continental Free Trade Area then in Niamey. Finally, a few decisions by the Executive Council of Ministers of the AU that were important, because the Executive Council has to meet twice a year, and so it was a normal meeting of the Executive Council. A few decisions that were taken, for example, around the budget of the AU, which one could see is a spin-off of the reforms. So, and that the fact is there is more transparency, there's more accountability when it comes to the African Union Commission and how it spends its money, because there is a sense that there's a greater self-funding of the AU. Around 40% of its budget is now being funded by AU member states. So the ambassadors in Addis Ababa and the ministers then looked at the budget. It's been reduced again for the second year running by about $40 million this time. There's been more scrutiny. There have been audits of all the various organs, the Pan-African Parliament, NEPAD, etc. And so one could say that in Niamey there was a sense that is another achievement, I would say, of the reforms. The Peace Fund as well, it was announced that there's now $120 million in the Peace Fund, which is very significant, funded by member states. And the sense is that where the African Union had to go around with a begging bowl to ask for donors for money if they just wanted to send a special envoy to a crisis or mediate in Sudan, etc., that actually There is now a fund that will enable the African Union to do conflict prevention or mostly mediation. It's not the 400 million target that is expected to be reached, or African Union member states hope will be reached by 2021. But Dr. Donald Kamaruka and others are very upbeat about that. So, but just two issues that were postponed in Niamey and that are very important in terms of implementing the AU reforms is a decision to discuss the structural reforms of the AU was postponed again until January next year, till the next summit. There was a decision taken earlier to reduce the number of departments in the AU, the number of commissioners from 8 to 6, to merge the Department of Political Affairs and Peace and Security, which is symbolically important because it shows the recognition that peace and security is also about elections and good governance, etc. The African peace and security architecture, the African governance architecture, those two, the merging of those two is something we have been working a lot on at the ISS. But there was, in Niamey, there was no agreement on some of the details of this restructuring. Now, this is going to have to happen soon because 2020 will be an important year for the AU Commission to get these changes implemented, because in 2021 there will be a whole new commission. So the 6 new commissioners will have to be elected in 2020, by the end of 2020, for them to start work in 2021, or at least the elections will take place in the beginning of 2021. So that was on the restructuring. There's many outstanding issues, and it is quite complicated. And the implementation of the AU reforms, there is definitely some pushback there. Finally, one of the issues where there's still lack of consensus amongst member states is the issue of partnerships. When the African continent is invited by another country to have an interaction, let's say India, the US, even France, etc., where in the past every single African country used to be represented by a member state, there was, as part of the reform, the sense that the continent, when it is invited by another country, should be represented by the Troika of Heads of State or the Bureau of the AU. But there's no consensus around that. There seems to be consensus that when it is an established partnership between the AU and, let's say, China, like the FOCAC, Japan with TICAD, which is happening next month, that established partnership would stay, and then of course the African Union and the European Union. But there is still a lot of debate, and again at Niamey it seemed as if that decision was not taken, and it might still take a while before there's any consensus on that. So all in all, an important summit. Egypt is still chairing the AU for 2019. Some important dates we are looking forward to for the rest of the year. And then in 2020, South Africa will be chairing the AU, and the theme for 2020 will then be silencing the guns. That will be quite a challenge for South Africa and for the AU in terms of implementing that, but there is also consensus that it is implementing the theme beyond 2020, how to take stock of the efforts that the AU has made up to now and how it's going to implement the roadmap to silencing the guns that was drawn up by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union.